Greetings, I'm Dack Rouleau.
I'm Christy Dopf.
And this is the Overwritten Book Club. In tonight's episode, this is our third reading of Machiavelli's The Prince. We will be reading chapters 9 through 14, I believe. I guess it doesn't exactly matter because we haven't been really adhering to that in our discussions anyway. But in this section of the book, Machiavelli is talking about how a principality or a government ought best to be organized and structured. He also talks quite a bit about the most effective organization of the military, and this will lend itself to some interesting discussion because this is where he seems to get more into the practical aspect of civic organization, I would say. It's less about the philosophical element, which I think is something we tend to talk about quite a bit in the independent media. This is getting more into the practical matters, like how do we actually organize things when the time comes to get off the page and actually put things into action.
Yeah, this first chapter 9 is, I was saying before we started, it's really dense. I felt like I needed a bit of a flow chart to kind of, because he is talking about what needs to happen, what a prince needs to do and not do, and also bringing into the nobles what they should or shouldn't be, how they should be a part of it, how they shouldn't be a part of it, and then the masses, the people underneath them.
So for those who either did not watch the first two episodes of the Overwritten Book Club or do not recall, in this context, the term prince is basically a sovereign or a head of state. Obviously, a prince in Machiavelli's time would not be exactly the same as an American president, but the concepts are close enough that we can more or less synonymize them for this discussion. And so chapter 9 is titled The Constitutional Principality. And so what he's talking about here is when a sovereign head of state has been appointed by the people through some kind of a vote, as opposed to, or some other form of civic selection, as opposed to a hereditary principality where it's the prince is in line to the throne according to lineage or something like that.
So before we get further, how do you see this different than a republic? Because Machiavelli doesn't really talk about republics in this book. But do you see the constitutional principality as a completely different beast than a republic?
Well, since I'm not a scholar of 16th century Italian politics, I'm sure there are some professors of 16th century Italian politics who are probably watching these videos and just shaking their heads the whole time. But what I think seriously is that this is a situation where even though the prince is chosen by the people, this is different from a republic where there are multiple people in making decisions who are chosen by the public. Right. This is where there's one person who has more or less absolute authority, but that person is still chosen by the public, as opposed to a republic where you have potentially hundreds of people competing for the right to decide public policy.
Right. And I feel like in the constitutional principality, the idea of choosing your leader might be solely based on the fact that their army beat yours. So you naturally align to, okay, this guy's our new leader. And this is what we're doing now. So I think there's a little bit more, and maybe it's because we focus so much on the military in this section that there is a lot of like whose military is best and who can protect us the best from whoever else is the bad guy coming after us.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that whole Russia-Crimea controversy from several years ago, where there was a question of how much choice people actually had at the ballot box. I know we're not supposed to talk about that in these channels, but it's an interesting parallel, at least, this idea that how much choice do you really have? Yeah. And Machiavelli seems to be at least skeptical of the idea of... He seems to be skeptical of the idea of republics, but that doesn't mean that he discounts the importance of having the people on your side completely. And that's something that's interesting. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But there's a quote from Machiavelli's discussion of constitutional principalities. We'll read it right now. Quote, I say that one becomes a prince in this case of constitutional principalities with the favor of the people or of the nobles. These two different dispositions are found in every city, and the people are everywhere anxious not to be dominated or oppressed by the nobles, and the nobles are out to dominate and oppress the people. These oppressed ambitions bring about one of three results: a principality, a free city, or anarchy, end quote. So, to me, the most interesting aspect of this was Machiavelli saying that the people, by their nature, are trying not to be dominated or oppressed by the nobles, the nobility, or the elites, while the nobles or the elites, by their nature, are trying relentlessly to dominate and oppress the people. Right. That's different from what we say in our modern society, where we tend to think of some of the elites as being on our side, possibly even working for us.
Right, right. And the idea that we would elect a leader who is outside of the elites or not part of the noble, and he would actually be that leader, is something I think we experienced with Trump.
Yeah.
And a lot of people got a rude awakening that even though they felt like he was one of us, he cares about the little guy, he really was just part of the elite.
Well, what's interesting, too, is regardless of what Trump was or was not trying to do, there was this idea that if we were voting for someone who was not part of the nobility, that was somehow a dangerous, suicidal thing to do.
Right.
The media told us 100 times a day, how could you possibly fathom voting for someone who's not part of the nobility?
Yeah.
That meant he was a bad candidate just in and of itself.
Right. And we talked about hereditary principality, like we kind of have that in this country with these few families, elites that seem to be trading the presidency back and forth. And like in 2016, it was just assumed Clinton was going to be the president because it was her turn. Much like she got the nomination very easily. Nobody really ran up against her besides Bernie.
Yeah, and in 2008, there was the concern against voting for her because people were sick of the Bush-Clinton dynasty just constantly going back and forth. But you could even argue that that's what's happening right now, where Joe Biden is just seen as Democratic Party royalty. And so it is almost like a hereditary monarchy in that sense. And how much choice do the people really have? Well, they get to choose between one of maybe 7 corporate emissaries. I mean, how much choice is there really? Right. The only other thing I want to say about this quote is it's interesting that he distinguishes between a free city and anarchy. He seems to use anarchy as a pejorative term, which I think is fair. The idea of there's no law, there's no order, there's no stability, people just running around. That seems to be different from the idea of a free city, which I'm guessing he means a city that is not subjugated by a foreign power.
Right. Yeah. I was kind of curious how he used free city and what it really like to him meant. And he didn't really, so far, he hasn't really given a specific example of what he sees as a free city in this current time.
Right. So with that, we'll move on to the next quote. Let's read it right now. Quote, "What happens is that when the nobles see they cannot withstand the people, they start to increase the standing of one of their own numbers, and they make him prince in order to be able to achieve their own ends under this cloak. The people in the same way, when they see they cannot withstand the nobles, increase the standing of one of themselves and make him prince in order to be protected by his authority," end quote. Well, this just seems to sort of reiterate what we were just saying, which is this idea that there is this perpetual conflict between the nobility and the peasantry.
Right. And I feel like this kind of reminded me of like the last election cycle and with people like Tulsi and Bernie, even AOC very much has this people build these politicians up because they feel like they're going to be protected under them, that if one of their own gets in there, they are going to do some good and actually help the situation, when in reality, like we've seen with AOC and very much Tulsi too, I think that they're not really in it for us.
No, there's this like pseudo-populism about them. Yeah. And so Machiavelli in this sense doesn't seem to denounce populism in and of itself. It's interesting how he doesn't seem to, I don't know if that was really something that occurred in his time, this idea of pseudo-populism, this idea of trying to manipulate the masses in order to accomplish whatever your goal is. It's interesting that this book was written, this is a note I had for the end of this, but we can just talk about it now. This book was written at a time when the masses were made ignorant and they were kept ignorant. And now we're living in a time when the masses have some sense of self-awareness. This idea of propaganda and mass manipulation does not seem to be something that was really a factor in Machiavelli's time.
No, I don't, not in the way it is, excuse me, now. But I do think in a couple chapters further on, we talk about, the church having power over principalities. So I think at this time, at least in Europe, the church was sort of the propaganda that kept people, religion was what kept people listening to the nobles.
Subjugated.
Yes, that's the word. So yeah, I think it's different. But when you take a step back, I think it's very much the same. It's just a tool to keep the masses in power with whether it's religion or some sort of fear-based thing that we're seeing now.
So let's talk about Machiavelli's distinction between which types of people gain power. Quote, a man who becomes prince with the help of the nobles finds it more difficult to maintain his position than one who does so with the help of the people. As prince, he finds himself surrounded by many who believe they are his equals, and because of that, he cannot command or manage them the way he wants, end quote. So that's where Machiavelli is talking about how if the prince is put into power with the help of the nobles are going to think that they are on the same standing as he, and they're going to be lusting for power. They're going to be conspiring and conniving against him. And that is different from a situation where the people put the prince into power because they, being the peasantry, are not able to get to his level in that way.
Right. Well, that just makes me think about like how corporations and the lobbying that goes on in our country really do control politics and politicians, and the president ultimately is controlled by the party.
Yeah, it's this idea that in the modern era, I think the nobility would be, some people call it the deep state, others, there's also the corporate influence that you're talking about. There's this institutional power, these institutions that have been established and embedded within our culture. Those are the modern day nobility. We don't really have the priestly class anymore. We have people who are controlling the culture. But it's interesting also, Machiavelli doesn't talk about the inherent goodness or virtue of the people. He's not saying that the masses are inherently good. He's just saying that the masses by their nature are less likely to conspire against the prince than the nobility.
Right, and they also don't have the power and the means to, even if they were to start to get that idea in their head.
Yeah, they don't have the mechanisms.
Right.
It's interesting how in a lot of these progressive commentators in the independent media, they always act like if the people could just make decisions, if the masses could call the shots, everything would be perfect. They believe in the inherent virtue and goodness and holiness of the masses. Machiavelli does not share that view, and I think I agree with Machiavelli on that point.
Right, and we talk about this a lot with different topics, how the left thinks all women are for abortion, or the left thinks all women are in one mindset of how evil men are, and those are just a couple examples. But there is this like lockstep thought process that the people are inherently good and we all think the same way, and that's not true. And we know that for a fact in this country, that we all do not think the same way because of there's how many different cultures and areas and how big the country is, that there's a lot of different schools of thought.
Well, wasn't the first episode of the Overwritten Report about how the media slandered Iowa and New Hampshire for being too white and not representing the views of black voters, as if all people of color in this country feel the same exact way about everything. Right. It's like, that's not true. And so we're kind of getting a little bit off the topic here, but it is interesting to see Machiavelli maintains this, not necessarily a skepticism of the people, but he doesn't have this gullible optimism for the people, the masses, as being this beautiful mass.
Right.
He just doesn't. So we have another quote here. This is actually relevant to what we're talking about. Quote, the people are more honest in their intentions than the nobles are, because the latter want to oppress the people, whereas the people want only not to be oppressed, end quote. Well, I feel like we're kind of just beating a dead horse here. Like,
Yeah.
it's pretty much what he's talking about. He's just saying they just don't want to be oppressed. He's not saying that they're beautiful, moral people.
Right. Yeah. The only thing they have in common is that they don't want to be oppressed.
Right. Well, here's a quote that takes it in a different direction. Quote, "A man who is made a prince by the favor of the people must work to retain their friendship. And this is easy for him because the people ask only not to be oppressed. But a man who has become prince against the will of the people and by the favor of the nobles should, before anything else, try to win the people over. This too is easy if he takes them under his protection. I shall only conclude that it is necessary for a prince to have the friendship of the people. Otherwise, he has no remedy in times of adversity." End quote. Well, I'll just let you go with this. What does this sound like for what we see in our modern culture? Any parallels here?
Yeah. Yeah, this is where he gets kind of this like back and forth. But what he's ultimately saying is like the prince really does need the people on his side because, I mean, they're going to fall out of favor with him. It contradicts a little bit of what he said before, whereas if the people aren't actually going to rise up against him, but he still wants to be in good favor with the people.
Well, I think he's saying that if the nobility were, say you have a prince who has been put into power according to the will of the people, and then the nobility go up against him, he can hope that the masses will come to his defense.
Right.
But if he has been put into power against the will of the people, and then the nobles are conspiring against him, the masses are just going to shrug their shoulders and move on.
Right, because as he talked about a few chapters ago, sometimes the people have more allegiance to the nobles because depending on how those nobles came to power, whether they have a hereditary lineage or they are elected in their own regions, that can impact the people who they're going to side with, the nobles or the prince.
Yeah, it's kind of like this idea that if the nobles have a hereditary lineage, they will have earned the people's, maybe not necessarily their affection, but people will be comfortable with the image of them constantly being there.
Right.
Maybe a modern parallel is that the president comes and goes, but you have Nancy Pelosi perpetually in power. You have Mitch McConnell perpetually in power. Pelosi and McConnell will never run for president, but they're always there running the show for the Democrats and the Republicans respectively. Yeah. And so there's almost a hereditary aspect to those gargoyles in Congress who just stay there forever. They almost feel like hereditary nobles in a way.
Yeah, just at a smaller view. It reminds me of like Scotland and Ireland, and they had those families of nobles that people like swore their allegiance to and would protect, and like everybody just there was just a lot of history there. And no matter who the ruling leader is, ultimately you've got to go the first step up first.
Right. And what he said about how the prince should always work to maintain the goodwill of the people or to earn the goodwill of the people, we're not really seeing that from our leaders anymore. A President Biden, regardless of how you feel about the validity of the election, clearly there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm for him, and he's done absolutely nothing to endear himself to the people in the 9 months since he took over.
I mean, many of the things that he promised, higher pay, student loan forgiveness, minimum wage going up, guaranteeing we'd all get $2,000 a month through the pandemic. Just like those simple things that would have appealed to the masses. None of them have happened.
And I think this was Trump's problem too, because you have to remember that Trump, he lost the popular vote by 2.5 million. And as president, he did absolutely nothing to endear himself to independents or Democrats. I think what Trump did was he expanded his influence among Republicans, but he made it very clear that he didn't respect anyone on the other side. And so he didn't work to endear himself to them either. And so you have this bizarre predicament where the people in power in this system of government, they actually need to be in power. They're not following Machiavelli's basic advice of trying to endear themselves to the masses. Like, what are they thinking?
Right. Well, we were talking the other day about the military-industrial complex, and if our country's military was going to go around to all these other countries and bomb them and destroy their culture and their whole way of living, then they're not really taking care of us at home.
No.
So it's like we're not even seeing the fruits of the labor to
Right.
entice us to say, sure, go ahead, keep doing that. Keep going into other countries.
Right.
We'll support you because we're reaping the benefits. We don't have any sort of trade-off that would make us want to continue this foreign policy.
Yeah, this was a conversation we were having off camera. We were saying that, all right, put the morality of the invasion of Iraq aside. If we went into Iraq just to take the oil and all of that stuff, if the American government had taken the wealth that they obtained through that mission and then like nationalized it and made sure that all of us got extra money in our paychecks and stuff like that, well, then people in this country could probably be persuaded to support these military conquests, even though they're obviously immoral and horrifying. Right. But they're not doing that. It just goes into the hands of a few oil executives and the CEOs of Halliburton and all of these other companies. So of course no one in this country is going to be supportive of it. But then there's the other side of the coin, which what you were saying made me think of it. We're also not making life good for the people of the countries that are being invaded. Right. So why would the people of Iraq welcome the United States and welcome that imperialist presence? Nobody seems to understand what Machiavelli was talking about.
No, and as evil as the United States is in their conquest of the world, you would think these basic tenets would be a pretty simple thing for them to follow.
Well, it's interesting. I was reading a little bit about this as we've been going on with the Prince. Apparently, the founding fathers were actually interested in Machiavelli. Apparently, George Washington wasn't the biggest fan, but John Adams used to write a lot about how he thought Machiavelli had a very intelligent view of how to organize a country and a government. And so it seems like if somewhere along the way the example was lost.
Yeah.
I really am thinking that if we learn from Machiavelli, obviously it wouldn't be a moral utopia, but it would be a lot more functional than what we have today.
Very true.
So the last part we were really going to talk about was chapter 12. We read through chapter 14, but the idea is sort of sustained throughout the subsequent chapters. This is where he's talking about military organization and mercenary troops. And this subject is interesting because nobody in the independent media, as far as I know, ever talks about military organization. You see all these progressives who like to talk all day long about the domestic policies. The government is supposed to provide free healthcare and free college and all this other stuff, but no one ever talks about national defense. And I think this is a subject where people avoid it because they recognize subconsciously their own ignorance. People recognize that if they're not, if they don't have military experience, if they're not veterans, then they're not going to be able to speak intelligently on these subjects. Yeah. But national defense is a real thing. I do not believe we're going to have this pacifistic utopia anytime soon. So national defense is legitimate. And Machiavelli talks about the distinction between different types of militias. He talks about auxiliary troops, mercenary troops, or troops that you're actually developing and fostering on your own. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an interesting point because it contrasts quite a bit with the dysfunction of the modern American military organization.
Yeah, he goes through and talks about mercenaries, about why ultimately they're not the best idea, and same with auxiliaries.
What type of military?
Mercenaries
yes,
is what he talks about first. The kind of like the for hire type of army and troops, and ultimately they have no allegiance to you. They are just kind of out to make the buck, whoever's going to pay them more. So they're very quick to turn on somebody and
opportunistic.
Not a dependable source of military or way to keep acquiring land and win for an extended amount of time. Mm-hmm. The auxiliary, having somebody else fight with you, he didn't really use the word alliance, but it was, in a way like a very like makeshift alliance, I think.
Yeah,
a bit.
He's talking about when you persuade a foreign country to fight on your behalf. Like the example he gives, like the French and the Swiss. But then what happens is after the war is over, suddenly you are in the debt of that foreign army.
Right. And I do feel like the United States often does that for others.
Oh, yeah.
And then, then the trade-off is we get to put a bunch of bases in your land and see you later. Like that's, we just kind of like plop down these bases after we've been over there helping fight whatever. And how many different countries have we done that in the last 100 years?
Well, I didn't even think about that. That's very interesting. But there's also the flip side to it, which is what we're seeing happening in Afghanistan, where we were using the Taliban to fight on our behalf. And then when we left, we saw, their loyalty was not to us anymore. And now the country's fallen into chaos. Like Machiavelli could have warned you about this, Biden, 500 years ago.
Yeah.
What are you thinking? Like, it is... I'm not saying Machiavelli knew everything, but it is amazing how he's clearly smarter than anybody who's alive today. Like, stop listening to Lloyd Austin and start listening. Like they don't know anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is a guy who had much more basic military technology at his hands, and he understood basic strategy in a way that the technocrats of today do not.
Yeah. I mean, he goes through a lot of different examples in these next 3 chapters, and Cesare Borgia is brought up yet again because he did all 3. And ultimately, because he was able to make this composite army, raise his own, after trying the first 2, he got real, genuine respect. And he was definitely feared because of that and the way he was able to use these different elements to build an army. One of the things unless you had more to say on those 3 things.
Well, I just want to say something about that, which is that I think that the modern American military is largely mercenary, because even though it's American citizens who are a part of it, they are obviously enticed largely by the financial benefits. Yeah. You have people who go into the military because it's a good job. And so...
Right.
It doesn't mean they're going to defect and go work for ISIS or something like that. But it does mean that they don't have like the philosophical affinity that Machiavelli says is necessary if you want to sustain troop morale.
Yeah, I think our country does have this like overwhelming sense of patriotism, and we focus on the military a lot, but that isn't necessarily why men and women go into it. Like you said, there's a financial benefit and gain to it. It's not just because they love their country and they believe in the mission or what our country is doing overseas.
Yeah, I don't think there was really a strong nationalistic sentiment to the military between World War II and the War on Terror. And that kind of the war on terror's patriotic energy that kind of depleted about 10 years ago. So now we're just kind of spinning our wheels again. But I didn't want to go too far on that. You had something else you wanted to say.
Just that I thought it was interesting, the points he made in the last chapter about learning the geography of your land. And it really circled back to why when you gain a new land, you need to be there in person. And he was talking about,
I didn't even think of that.
About being a good military commander is understanding and familiarizing yourself with the geography of the land and understanding how you can have an army come in and, the mountains and the valleys and the rivers and how you can use that to your advantage. So I thought that was like, he's made that point so many times in this book that you have to go there. You have to live there. Mm-hmm. And this was like one of those practical reasons why it was beneficial for you to befriend the people there and learn the geography. And obviously he talks about being unarmed versus armed and why you'd want to be armed like that. I think is pretty obvious, but I just thought that was an interesting segue that he made.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because taking it out of the militaristic element, it goes to this idea that the elites or the nobility are so far removed from the peasantry that they can't actually relate to them anymore. We see that quite a bit in our modern political culture, that they're so detached from reality that you hear Pete Buttigieg talking about Abby Wambach or something like that instead of talking about people's paychecks. This idea of being estranged from your own country, it raises questions about why would you even bother pursuing power in your country? You don't even understand what your country is.
Well, and it also just like now kind of reminded me of the campaign trail when Joe Biden says he's in Vermont and he's in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And, they don't even know where they are. They don't even know what these people do. Didn't Hillary Clinton make something up about keeping hot sauce in her purse because she was in the South? Or they just have these little stupid I
didn't hear that, but that's pretty dumb.
Yeah, they just they say these things because they think it'll appeal to the people in the region, but they actually, this is talking about geography, but they don't even know the culture, let alone like the landscape, you know? So it just really shows how far removed politicians can be from their own country when they're out there on the campaign trail.
Well, that's why I find this book so interesting, is Machiavelli wasn't trying to appeal to the masses in the sense. He was writing this book for a man who was about to become a prince, explaining, this is what I think you should do. And so he obviously put more thought into it. He wasn't trying to propagandize. He was trying to educate.
Right.
And that's why I find the book so rewarding. It's also, I know this is your first time reading it, but this is my second time. And I haven't read it in over 3 years. I'm getting so much more out of it now than I did 3 years ago, because I'm coming to it as an older person with a bit more knowledge and experience. And to me, it just continues to illuminate our present situation more and more effectively all the time.
Yeah.
So was there anything else we wanted to say on this before we should?
I was good
all
with that.
All right, well, I think this has been a pretty good episode of the Overwritten Book Club. So we read through chapter 14 of Machiavelli's The Prince. Did we know what chapter we were going to read up to next time?
I believe, are going to read through 20. So the next
all right.
6.
All right, so we're going to read through chapter 20, so we will stop at the beginning of chapter 21 for next time. Hopefully, this respiratory condition will be fixed by then. I hope it's not COVID. I don't want Dr. Fauci coming and wagging his finger in my face. I'll have a few things to say to him if he does. But yeah, this has been the Overwritten Book Club. We're reading Machiavelli's The Prince. And are we prepared to say what book we're going to be reading next? It's
actually we are.
We're not sure when we're going to have the next book for the Overwritten Book Club, but we're going to be reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. That's what we agreed to, right? Okay, good. We're going to be reading that pretty soon. We'll give you a date for when we're going to read it. That should be pretty interesting. But we're for next week, we'll read up through chapter 20, and we will be round in the corner coming to the end of Machiavelli's The Prince. So leave any comments here, any questions you want us to address in our next video. I promise I will not be dead of this respiratory infection by then. And I will just say thank you for watching this episode, and good night.
Good night.